SMU law professor Nathan Cortez. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. So we have this legal standoff now in the Fifth Circuit or Fifth Court of Appeals, State Court of Appeals, between Governor Abbott and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton and Dallas County Judge Clay Jenkins. And I think the $64,000 question is, who's right? Is the governor right? Is he on solid legal ground? Or is Judge Jenkins?
Well, it's the dispute raises a bunch of really interesting questions. Typically, in our system, the governor is at the top of the pyramid, and state and local officials take orders from the governor. And here you have a dispute about whether the governor's executive order of July supersedes any local or county orders that are contrary to it. And so you're going to see this wind its way through the courts, and the courts are going to have to figure out what the Texas Disaster Act requires and what it prohibits. And so you're seeing Governor Abbott and Ken Paxton argue that whatever the governor say goes, and it immediately trumps all conflicting orders and rules from Clay Jenkins and other county judges around the state. What Clay Jenkins and others are arguing essentially is that Governor Abbott's order isn't really grounded in the Texas Disaster Act, because the act speaks in terms of preventing disasters, preparing disasters, responding to disasters, mitigating disasters. It doesn't say anything about taking the least restrictive means, as the Abbott briefs keep repeating.
So you said that the courts are going to have to figure out what the Disaster Act means. Does precedent come into play here? Because this is not the first time in which we've seen this. This played out last year, and it seemed as if what the governor said, the counties abided by. Now the counties are saying, we're not going to abide by this because we just feel that strongly that the governor's not doing the right thing here, right?
Yeah, so there are some precedents, but before 2020, this was pretty uncharted territory. We didn't have a lot of cases or a lot of open conflicts between governors and county officials, for example. And in 2020, you had litigation over mailbox voting and voting hours and such, where counties were saying, look, you're going to make the pandemic worse by not allowing these mail drop-off locations to remain open, et cetera. And so there have been a few appellate court decisions, including Texas Supreme Court decisions, that looked at these types of disputes. We don't have anything that is exactly like this case, where you have local officials arguing that masks are the least we can do. They follow CDC guidelines to deal with the Delta variant. School districts think it's the very least they can do. And then a governor's order purports to limit their authority to impose those recommendations and those requirements that are urged by the CDC right now. So it's not clear who's going to win. I hesitate to try to wager on which party is going to win. I will say that it's going to boil down to how you construe the Texas Disaster Act. It's almost a 50-year-old statute. We see it deployed occasionally, but never in a manner like this. And it really boils down to, can Governor Abbott prohibit localities from responding to disasters in certain ways? Or does the Disaster Act really speak in terms of active measures to respond, not kind of negatively limiting local responses?
So, and of course, I would imagine that when they wrote this Disaster Act, nobody was thinking about a pandemic such as COVID. They were probably thinking more about hurricane response or something to that nature.
Yeah, and so again, usually, the Texas Disaster Act talks about local cooperation with state officials, getting everyone on the same page. Governor Abbott's order says, look, we want uniformity throughout the state, but that uniformity is you can't require masks. And so what we're seeing is kind of scientific recommendations and local public health officials believing one course of action is inconsistent with the governor's order. Now, the governor's order repeatedly says that he has the authority to do this from the Texas Disaster Act. So again, it boils down to, what does the Texas Disaster Act allow? Does it allow the governor to prohibit localities from responding in certain ways, or does it only contemplate kind of affirmative steps you can take to recover, mitigate, respond, prepare for disasters?
Does this set up the question on whether the Disaster Act or the governor's executive order is constitutional regarding the state constitution?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So you don't see many constitutional claims in the complaints that have been filed. Clay Jenkins received a temporary restraining order against the Abbott executive order. And the response and the request for the Fifth Court of Appeals here in Dallas didn't really talk about constitutional problems. Now, constitutional issues may mean two separate things. It may mean individual rights. I don't see much in the complaints or in the briefs that talk about an individual right to not wear masks or a constitutional right to require masks or prohibit masks. Rather, if there was a constitutional confrontation here, it would be over kind of the supremacy of the governor's orders vis-a-vis county officials, local public health and county officials, regarding what they think is the best course here.
Ultimately, is this going to go to the Texas Supreme Court?
I would think so. We had a very quick temporary restraining order. There was one also entered in San Antonio, I believe. Now courts of appeals have been asked to determine who's right. And whoever loses at the Court of Appeals level has every incentive to appeal to the Texas Supreme Court. So I'd be surprised if it didn't.
And would there be any federal claims whatsoever? I know this is all taking place within the state, but just wanted to ask you that.
You know, I don't see any. I hesitate to say there's never a federal claim, because there's lots of creative ways you could try to invoke federal jurisdiction here. But we're not talking about CDC requirements. We're not talking about the federal government threatening to withhold funds. This seems to be kind of a local battle between state and county officials. And so, you know, there's one reference in Ken Paxton's brief to a Supreme Court case that's about 10 years old, a US Supreme Court case. And I didn't really see how it was relevant to this state dispute.
And let me ask you just a couple of other questions. On what basis would a local judge, you know, allow for a temporary restraining order? Would that be based on not really on the merits of the case, but just to have a higher court look at it? Or is this lower court looking at it, even though it's already been appealed to the Fifth Court of Appeals?
Well, so we had two trial courts, two district courts enter temporary restraining orders, and of course the one in Dallas did. And that was based on the threat of irreparable harm. So the standard to get a temporary restraining order is you have to show the court that there would be irreparable harm if the order wasn't entered. And so, you know, if someone were to bring a similar case in Fort Worth or Austin or Houston or another town or city, a court may say, you know, this very issue is pending before the Fifth Court of Appeals in Dallas, and they may wait to see how that process plays out and if the Texas Supreme Court ultimately weighs on it. So I imagine parties could file similar actions, but I think this will probably be fast-tracked to the Texas Supreme Court given the urgency.
And we need to know, right? The public needs to know what the end all is, right?
Yeah, one of the frustrating things is the public is already a little confused and understandably has whiplash. You know, 1 second we should wear masks, the next second it's okay not to. 1 minute vaccines are totally protective against one strain of COVID-19. Another minute they may not be as effective as we thought. 1 minute, we understand how COVID is transmitted. The next minute, Delta comes around and is 2.5 times more contagious. So there's a lot of confusion. People understandably have whiplash. It's like watching a tennis ball go back and forth if you're sitting at the net. So yeah, we need clarity, and we need kind of good faith cooperation between our branches of government here.
And my last question to you is, during the regular legislative session, there were bills filed that would have clarified what the governor's, ability to, put out these executive orders before having a legislature chime in on this. They didn't pass. Now we're in a special session. And COVID is one of the topics on the governor's agenda. And I'm wondering if there needs to be some legislation so that this is more clear cut than just having a judicial ruling. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so sometimes Congress or state legislatures will jump in to clarify when there's deep confusion about how a law operates. With something this contentious, it's hard to envision that there's going to be a ton of clarity provided by the legislature, because it's such a zero-sum contest, and there are active disputes. Sometimes a legislature can rally and say, here's what the statute should mean. We're going to amend it in the following ways to make the governor's powers clearer. You've seen this throughout history. When we're faced with a disaster, an emergency, the legislature will often step in and usually expand the government's authority to deal with a disaster. So it's a little unusual to see movements to restrict the government's authority in the face of a disaster. But who knows if the legislature will act on anything this special session.
And that's a whole other story. But as you know, so all right, well, I guess we're just really going to have to wait and see. And like you said, this really comes down to how judges or justices feel, the extent of the Texas Disaster Act and how much authority the governor really does have on the pandemic.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's going to come down to how you read the act and how expansively, how broadly you read it, or how narrowly you read it.
All right. Anything else you'd like to say?
No, I mean, it's an interesting case, and people are going to be watching this closely to decide who's in charge. How much freedom do our local officials have to respond to local conditions?
All right. SMU law professor Nathan Cortez, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your insight.
Thanks.